going. We're past 9 o'clock. Very, very welcome to you all. This is a discussion that we've been trying to arrange for a little while. If you like, it is coming from Scotland's Open Government team, but it's much more than that. This is in the way that we have been trying to work in Scotland. It's a really collaborative effort. And we are here really to learn from the international experience that we're going to hear from Claudia Chwalisz from OECD, and just to see if there are things that we can learn in Scotland, if there are learnings that we can share, but also what does it mean here if we're going to try and be much more thoughtful about how we bring people into the conversations that affect their lives. Government has learned a lot of lessons during the COVID period, I think, and one of them absolutely reinforcing something we already know and have been trying to do in Scotland is that actually the most effective way of solving problems is to make sure that the people who are involved in being affected by those problems are actually involved in the solutions. So what we're going to do this morning is hear from Claudia and the amazing work that OECD have done right around the world, looking at how citizens can get effectively involved in, particularly in long form deliberative events. This is about really recognizing and trying to harness the wisdom of crowds, trying to get a much more subtle discussion. This isn't about debating, it's about deliberating, making sure that we can all hear and properly listen to each other and take account of other people's views, moving the rhetoric away from the political divisions that we've seen over recent years. So I think we'll wait another second or two for stragglers, but first of all, I will introduce our panel to you. I'll introduce Claudia first, but Claudia Chwalisz is an absolutely ace researcher. I've known her work since before she went to the OECD, but I live in awe of her ability to extract from everyone around the world their information and then distill it into something that is really valuable and useful, and you're all going to learn from it this morning. On our panel, we very deliberately gone today right across our system in public services. So we're starting with Gillian. Gillian Baxendine is the head of the engagement unit for the committees in Scottish Parliament. And she and her team have been incredibly thoughtful about how that public voice adds to and enhances the work of the committees in Parliament. Because democracy in Scotland isn't just something you do at the ballot box once every 5 years. This is about how we make voices much more effective. Simon Cameron works for COSLA and has been really thoughtful about how we get deliberative processes in all sorts of ways through the work of our local authorities. Niamh, who is here with us from Scottish Government and indeed the Cabinet Office just today, is here to her work has been in digital democracy and thinking about how we apply that. And today she's going to try and help us wade our way through some of the questions, because we hope people will put questions into Q&A throughout. And please use the chat function if you have things you want to talk about or ask us. And finally, but never least, Oliver Escobar of Edinburgh University, who is a leading thinker, both in Scotland, but also internationally. And if you follow him on Twitter, you get a really good view of his dogs. They are just gorgeous. And they lighten my life every now and then. So we're going to start this morning by hearing about Claudia's publication, The Deliberative Wave. We will then go into a few minutes from us, from across the if you like, the system of public services. I'll represent government, and then Oliver will challenge us all and ask questions. And I hope you will keep your questions coming, and we can then have a bit of a discussion about it. There are almost 100 people had signed up for today, so we hope it will be a really valuable discussion. I'll stop there and hand over to Claudia to introduce herself properly, but also to give us some real learning from her international work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doreen. It's really such a great pleasure to be here. I mean, it would have been so much nicer in person, but still, even virtually with a Scottish audience, I have a very soft, warm spot in my heart for Scotland, having lived there a little bit. I mean, over 10 years ago now, but still, so really great to be here. My name is Claudia Chwalisz. I'm leading the area of work on innovative citizen participation at the OECD. I'm just going to share my screen with you for a few minutes here. So hopefully you can see that now. So what I'll be sharing with you today are the key findings from a big report that we published in June of this year called Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions, Catching the Deliberative Wave. To give you a little bit of context of where this work kind of situates within the OECD and as an organization, especially since this event is being co-organized with Open Government Scotland, you know, our work really sits within the wider work and thinking about open government. That citizen participation is just one part of it. So I work quite closely with colleagues who are also working on open government and this idea of an open state more broadly, working on civic space, public communication for open government, transparency and accountability. We also work quite closely with the other colleagues within our open and innovative government division who work on digital government and public sector innovation. So all of that to say that, you know, this is really fascinating and important work, but it's also by no means some sort of magic silver bullet to solving our democratic problems, and all of these things need to be really working together for that. But that being said, I'm now going to turn over to the deep dive into the findings of this report, and it looks at 289 representative deliberative processes. Now, I understand that that term is a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to take a minute to define what it is that we're actually talking about when I say representative deliberative process. It does refer to things that are often called citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, citizens' councils, consensus conferences, which might already start putting some ideas into your head. But really, what all of these processes have in common is that at the heart of them sits a small representative group of people, which is chosen through random selection to reflect societal diversity. And this group of people is tasked with developing recommendations to a public problem by a public authority. They have the time and the resources then to deliberate, which means that they have access to broad and diverse information. They're able to weigh arguments and consider different perspectives, with the explicit intention of aiming to find common ground and to develop collective and informed recommendations. So this is quite different and one of the distinguishing factors to most other forms of participation, which don't necessarily have that common ground element to them. Here, the aim is really for people to be working together and at the end of the day to have a set of recommendations for the public authority, which are informed by evidence, informed by inputs from stakeholders, and are developed by finding some consensus on where a diverse group of people can find some common ground on them. Now, to make this sound a little bit abstract, I'll start with just a couple of examples of what we mean by that. I feel like many of the people here in our virtual room with us might be familiar with it, so I won't spend too much time on this, but many of you might have come across the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which took place from 2016 to 2018. 100 randomly selected people reflecting Irish society were tasked with treating 5 different big questions that had to do with constitutional issues. One of them, for example, was about abortion. The Citizens' Assembly gave recommendations to the Special Parliamentary Committee on whether or not there should be a recommendation on changing the constitution regarding abortion, but also gave them concrete recommendations for how that legislation should change should the people wish to vote for a change. So this is something that has received quite a bit of coverage, so you might have come across it. Of course, there's also the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, which I think most of you are probably maybe even more familiar with than I am, with the 100 citizens that have had a chance to come together for 8 meetings. I mean, slightly altered because of COVID, of course. So I think in person from October 2019 until February 2020, with a break in between, and taking up their work again in September, and they'll be issuing their recommendations in just a couple of weeks. So I'm sure we'll talk about this in the discussion with the other panelists later. But these are the types of processes that are part of the 289 examples that we have in the OECD report. So to be included within this analysis, all of these case studies had to have at least 3 different things in common for comparability reasons. So the first being representativeness. The participants were randomly selected and demographically stratified to be broadly representative of the community. Secondly is deliberation. Now, this is something that requires time. So we've operationalized it as a minimum of 1 full day of face-to-face meetings. And the third being impact. So we only looked at the examples that were commissioned by a public authority that would then have the authority to be able to respond to or act on the recommendations that came out of it. Now, there's lots of good examples that were also initiated by academia, by civil society, but here we're only looking at the ones that really are by government authorities. Now, why is the OECD even looking at representativeness and deliberation as concepts? So it's something that I get asked sometimes. Now, this work is linked to the OECD recommendation of the Council on Open Government, which was issued in 2017. The OECD as an institution, us working at it as the Secretariat, what our job is to collect data, collect good practices from all the member countries and beyond, to analyze those, and on that basis, develop recommendations for the member countries to follow. And in 2017, 2 of those provisions of the Open Government recommendation really emphasized providing equal and fair opportunities for stakeholders to be informed and consulted and actively engaged in all phases of the policy cycle. And it also put emphasis on promoting innovative ways to effectively engage with stakeholders to source ideas and co-create solutions. So what all of this is saying in a nutshell is really going beyond traditional top-down consultation and creating opportunities for more informed forms of engagement that are designed in a way to really be more inclusive, to hear from all the different voices in the room. So deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies really meet these criteria. Of course, they're not the only form of innovative citizen participation, but they are one of the key ways. And we've also noticed that countries have been using them more and more frequently as well. But before I go on to the data itself, I did want to also spend a moment of talking about some of the more normative reasons of why we're talking about representativeness and deliberation as being able to really live up to those principles that are recommended in the OECD recommendation on open government. So through our work with the literature, but also on the basis of the empirical data, we found there were 7 key reasons that really stood out to our research team about why representativeness and deliberation have specific benefits for policymaking. So one is that they tend to lead to better policy outcomes because deliberation results in public judgments rather than just top of mind public opinions, which end up being more useful then to policymakers. Secondly, is that through their design of involving representative groups of people, being done transparently, giving people time, they're able to garner greater legitimacy for public decision makers to make hard choices. Thirdly, is that there is a potential for them to enhance public trust in government and democratic institutions by giving citizens a more effective role in public decision-making. Fourth is that they signal civic respect and empower citizens, really treating them as being competent and able to provide recommendations on complex policy topics that really go beyond what would be a simple opinion on an issue. Fifth is making governance more inclusive by opening the door to more representative groups of people. And now there's a lot of research which shows that many other open types of participation tend to involve disproportionately certain demographics, notably those who are male, who are well educated, who are well off, who are more urban, who are white. So by involving a random sample that is representative of the wider public, representative deliberative processes are really bringing in new voices and more diverse voices into the room to influence public decision makers. Sixth is that also by their design, they can strengthen integrity and prevent corruption by ensuring that groups and individuals with money and power can't have undue influence on a public decision. And finally, there's some emerging evidence on this, but there is new work being done that shows that deliberative processes do have the potential to help counteract polarization and disinformation as well. But beyond all these reasons, we decided at the OECD to take a deep dive into representative deliberative processes in particular, also because we really had a demand from member countries to better understand the use of these types of forms of engagement. When are they actually useful? What types of policy issues are they most effective for, etc. We had a sense that they were being used more and more without this sort of in-depth comparative international analysis. And once we collected the data, that turned out to be very true. So we found that 289 examples, 282 of them ended up being from OECD countries. The earliest example that met all three of our criteria was from 1986. But what we noticed in the data is that there was an initial sort of first wave of interest around the late 90s, early 2000s by public authorities in this form of engagement, and that there's been a second wave that's been really building since 2010 and continuing to do so, because we had to cut off the data collection in October 2019. So actually the Scottish Citizens Assembly isn't even part of this, for example. But we did calculate that there were another 30 to 40 processes that had either been announced, like the Scottish Assembly, or just getting underway at that time, which really would have put that 2019 figure completely off the charts, basically double what it is there. Just to give you an idea of really since last year how much more prominent this form of public engagement has become. We found these cases for representative deliberative process in many different countries. We didn't have any limits on I mean, we were looking even beyond OECD countries, even though we found most of the examples in OECD countries. So there were 18 different countries, as well as examples from the EU and international levels. Most of them come from Germany, Australia, Canada, and Denmark. And we think there is some sort of link between certain models of deliberative processes originated in these countries. So without getting too technical and going into the details, there's a process called the planning cell, which originated in Germany. One form of the citizens jury has been used really prominently in Australia. The Citizens Assembly and Citizens Reference panels come from Canada. The consensus conference originated in Denmark. So these are all different forms of deliberative processes that have their origins in these countries where we find the most examples. And it's important to also to note that these examples of almost 300 cases come from all levels of government. So around half of them are from the local level, 30% from the regional state level, 15% from the national federal level, and 3% from the international level as well. We had a look at what kinds of policy issues were being treated using a representative deliberative process. What we found, first of all, was that there was just actually quite a huge diversity of different topics. But then beyond that, certain types of policy issues did come up again and again. So urban planning, health, environment, strategic planning, and infrastructure were really the types of policy issues that are addressed most frequently for representative deliberative processes. Although what we found as well that when trying to have a sense of whether this approach is appropriate, a better way perhaps of thinking about it is that there are three types of problems that deliberative processes are well suited to address. So the first being values-based dilemmas. By this we mean that even if a problem may seem technical on the surface, sometimes it's really actually underdriven by values of what kind of society do we want to be living in. So as an example, for instance, all these questions surrounding facial recognition technology. It sounds very technical as a problem, but actually that would be considered as a values-based dilemma because it raises to the surface all sorts of issues in terms of, to what extent are we okay with surveillance? In what circumstances might it be ethical or not to use this technology, etc. The second are complex problems that require trade-offs. So these types of processes are not really useful when there's a quite binary set of options on the table, or there's not a lot of room for maneuver in terms of different options to address a problem. Where they're helpful is when there's some complexity at the heart of an issue, and there's really multiple ways forward that require weighing the different trade-offs, the benefits, the costs, considering the different legal, institutional, budgetary constraints, working within those to come up with different proposals that would be acceptable to that community in particular. And then the third being long-term questions that go beyond the short-term incentives of elections. And I think that one's probably a bit more self-explanatory. What we developed off of the back of all of the empirical data in this report, but also working a bit more qualitatively with an expert group of practitioners, civil servants, and academics, was to develop good practice principles to guide policymakers and practitioners who are wanting to put into place representative deliberative processes. So up on the screen here, I have the 11 principles up. I won't go into detail for them now just due to the limits of time of this presentation, but I'm very happy to pick up on this and go back to them if that's of interest to the people who are here with us today to talk about them in further depth. Because the last thing that I wanted to end on is that in this report and in our wider thinking on this topic at the OECD, we're not just looking at these individual one-off ad hoc processes, but also thinking a bit more broadly about reimagining democratic institutions and institutionalizing the use of public deliberation for certain types of policy problems. So in the report, we've identified 17 different examples of institutionalization that have taken place so far, which have fallen into these three different categories. And I do want to say that it is something that we're thinking about further to build on this work about what could be the other potential options and routes we could be thinking about. But just to briefly explain what I mean by these. So the first being the first route to institutionalization being a permanent or ongoing structure for representative citizen deliberation. So one example of this, I'm going to go to the next slide briefly, is something called the Ostbelgien Model. So Ostbelgien is the German-speaking region of Belgium. The smallest region, around 80,000 people, but it has its own regional parliament with regional competencies. And in February 2019, that parliament voted unanimously to put in place a new democratic institution called the Citizens' Council. And the Citizens' Council is an agenda-setting body. It's up to them to decide what are the 1 to 3 issues every year that should be put to citizens' panels. And each of these citizens panels, it's also in itself a deliberative process with 25 to 50 people. It must meet for at least three meetings over the course of 3 months, and it has a remit to provide recommendations on that issue back to the regional parliament. And the Citizens' Council also has a second role, which is monitoring to ensure that that regional parliament actually has the parliamentary debates, which it's now required by legislation to have, and to respond to those recommendations that have come from the citizens panels. So the very first issue that the Citizens Council had chosen in the autumn of 2019 was how to improve the working conditions of healthcare workers. So this was before the COVID pandemic. I would say it was quite an apt topic, and also an example of why you can trust citizens to be putting important issues on the agenda that they feel people in Parliament are not giving enough attention to. So that is one example of what we mean by a more permanent or ongoing structure for representative citizen deliberation. The second form of institutionalization, though, could also be in the format of having requirements for organizing representative deliberative processes under certain conditions. So one example of that, for instance, is the Citizens Initiative Review, which is a process that comes from Oregon in the United States, but has also been used in other states and has now also been piloted in Switzerland and in Finland, and there's talk about in other places. But what this means is that there's a deliberative process that takes place before a ballot measure or like a referendum type of vote. So in the Citizens Initiative Review, there's usually around 25 people who are randomly selected. They're brought together for 4 full days to be able to weigh the evidence for both sides of the question at hand. They hear from a wide variety of experts and stakeholders, and then they draft together the most compelling arguments for both sides of that ballot issue. And those compelling arguments for both sides then get distributed to all voters with their ballot paper. So, so this is one example of how you could institutionalize under certain circumstances. There's a deliberative process that takes place before something else, for example. And then finally, the other type of approach that we've seen is having rules in place allowing citizens to demand a representative deliberative process on a specific issue. So this usually takes place in the form of a petition requiring a minimum number of signatures to then launch a deliberative process afterwards. So we tend to think of these kinds of approaches more for instigating a parliamentary debate or for a referendum, but here we're thinking about citizens demanding a deliberation. And we've seen these rules in place in many different Polish cities now, as well as the Austrian state of Vorarlberg, where citizens have used this right fairly recently, actually in 2017, to demand a citizen deliberation on land use rights, which then took place. So these are the sorts of approaches that we're talking about, and we think at the OECD are generally, you know, I suppose in one of the kind of future trends that we're seeing in terms of the thinking around deliberation. So we have 289 examples in the report. The vast majority of those are one-off ad hoc processes, which also means that every time there's a need to somewhat start from scratch when it comes to putting in place the infrastructure needed to do a random selection process, to know how to design an agenda, to have the facilitation skills in place, and so on. And so institutionalization is also one of the reasons why, you know, thinking a bit more how to make this permanent could help make it something that can be organized more easily, less expensively, but also would allow for citizens to be playing a meaningful role in shaping policies on a recurring, ongoing basis, and helping policymakers also make more of those types of tough decisions that these processes are really well suited to address. So I will leave it there. You can find the report through the QR code that I have up on my screen. Otherwise, I'll also post a link into the chat so you can find it. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the reactions from the panelists and having questions from everyone listening. So thanks very much for your time.
Okay, great. I think that's me coming in, is it, Doreen? Or are you saying something?
Yes, you coming in.
That's me. Okay, great. So yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks, Claudia, for the presentation. I can see there's already a lot of interesting points coming up in the chat. Please do use the Q&A section of Zoom to put the questions, because Niamh has very kindly agreed to organize them a little bit so I can keep an eye on them and bring them at different points of the panel discussion. So I'm Oliver, I work at Edinburgh Uni. I'm in Edinburgh. I see through the chat that there are lots of people from Edinburgh, but also from all sorts of interesting places around the world. It's always interesting as well to to see how Edinburgh in itself can contain the 4 seasons at the same time, because it's raining right here, but others talk about parts of Edinburgh being under the sun. So it's, yeah. And what I want to do with this panel discussion is to try and, you know, we are at a very important point of the evolution of the field of deliberative democracy. It's a point of maturity. It's a field that now is becoming more mainstream. It's a field that is encountering the pressures and the pleasures of entering institutional landscapes that are sometimes not necessarily ready, or sometimes they are having to adapt pretty quickly to some of these innovations. So there are lots of important questions to be asked, and I'm sure that Claudia's presentation is giving us a lot of food for thought. The first section of the rest of this session is going to be about getting a reaction from some of our colleagues here who work within different institutions in Scotland, and it's actually it's quite refreshing to have this discussion, because some of these conversations about mini publics, I'm sorry Claudia, I'm just going to use the mini publics short term, just we might come back to terminology later if people want to come back to that. We used to talk about these things in civil society, in social movements, in sort of community spaces, radical spaces, democratic innovation spaces. So I find it quite refreshing that we're now talking about this stuff in the context of institutional work and democratic reform. So I'm delighted that we have a spectacular panel of colleagues from different institutions in Scotland. We are going to start with Gillian Baxendine, who works at the Scottish Parliament. Of course, it always needs to be said that although they are here to give us an institutional perspective, these institutions are not monolithic. So this is very much the perspective they take from the position they occupy within those complex systems. And I just want to invite everyone to keep popping questions in the Q&A. I'll come back to them as we go. But first, I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to address a couple of questions. The first one being, what can Scotland learn from this report and this really sizable and interesting piece of research? And where is Scotland now on these practices from your perspective, from where you sit? We're going to start with Gillian, and then I'm going to come to Simon Cameron, to give us a perspective from the COSLA, well, the Convention of Scottish Local Authority Areas, and then I'll come to Doreen with her Open Government Partnership hat to give us a sense of where the Scottish government sits on these questions. But let's start with Gillian. Gillian, can I give you 3 or 4 minutes just to get your initial reflections on what can we learn from the report and where are we in Scotland from your perspective on these issues?
Sure, thanks Oliver, and it's great to be here with everybody today. I mean, what strikes me most from the report is how much of this is happening, and I think it's really important for us not to think that there's a model that we are all using. There's lots and lots of different ways people are doing this, and it's growing and developing. It's not that there's a way of doing citizens' assemblies that we should now all be copying and implementing. And I think that is equally true when we're talking about institutionalizing. Claudia gave us kind of 3 different ways of doing that. I think these processes need to be adapted to the culture of the country and the institution they're being delivered in, the level of government, and also to keep pushing them, to keep experimenting with what works and what might be done differently and what might work for different things. And in terms of the context of where I'm looking at this from, in the Scottish Parliament, when we were set up 21 years ago, we had the chance to kind of look across public participation and try to be really innovative, really leading edge. And of course, over 21 years, things have changed a lot. So at that stage, having a public petitions committee was incredibly innovative, and now it's a much more mainstream thing. And I think we're going through that process now with this kind of deliberative activity. My own unit in the Parliament was set up 2 years ago with this as one of the things we were to sort of try out and test. And rather delightfully, we were given the remit also to make mistakes and learn from them, which is unique in my many years in civil service and parliamentary work. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do. We've run 2 different events with a 3rd one in the planning. And because we are part of the Parliament, we're all parliamentary staff who are designing and facilitating the events. I think that's given us a lot of flexibility to try different ways of doing things and to not be too purist. And I'm happy to talk more about what we've done. I won't go into any detail now, but 2 of the events we've run have been very different from each other, and the 3rd one is going to be very different again. And what we're trying to be is very, very pragmatic to say, well, what is it we want to achieve? Is this a good way of doing it? And how can we experiment to make it fit the Scottish parliamentary context?
You're kind of intriguing us now. Just give us a tiny example of the ones that you've done so far.
So the first one we did was probably a very classic citizens jury for a committee on an environmental issue. And I think what we got from that was, I guess, the huge energy and enthusiasm that could come from the participants. So we had our academic advisor saying he never thought they could pick up the issue so quickly and make such intelligent, informed comments on them over the course of a weekend. So he was really amazed by people's capacity, and I was really amazed by how excited people were at the end of that, and how keen they were to keep taking part and to do more, and to not this to be the end of things. I don't think we mastered how you use that energy going forward, and that's a big learning point for us. But I think thinking about this in terms of how it empowers people, not just about how it answers a question, is really, really important. And then we did something completely different that was out in communities, and rather than answering a question, it was giving a committee questions to ask. So it was about primary care, and the committee used the evidence from the public to really challenge some of the sort of powerful interest groups, like professionals, like health service management, and say, you know, you're not delivering what people want, and how can you do that? So that was a really different, interesting model. The 3rd one we'll be doing completely online, and with a kind of mixture of in-person deliberation and kind of offline discussions, and so that'll be a whole different model as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Gillian. I'll probably come back to you, because some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A box are going to be relevant to your work. And at the end of this round, through the panelists, I'll also come to Claudia for some of the initial questions. But let's first hear from Simon Cameron for a perspective across local government in Scotland. Hi.
Thanks for that, Oliver. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to be part of the kind of the discussion and to hear Claudia's report. And like Gillian was just saying, I think, you know, for Scotland, it's always the opportunity to learn and look around the world and see what others are doing and benchmark ourselves and say, how can we continue to move forward? And I think Gillian makes an important point. It is about how we adapt processes to fit local needs. One thing we're very kind of clear on across Scottish local government and the rest is that our communities are all very different, and how people will want to engage, the levels to which they'll want to engage, and the need to which they'll want to engage will vary. So that point that Gillian makes about a purist approach, I think we've got to encourage people to come forward and use the processes in ways that work best for them, so that they do feel that we're achieving outcomes. Obviously, that's the language that we use across both government and Scottish Government in terms of the work that we do. We've been working through clearly very difficult times, not only currently, but in at least the past 10 or more years in terms of the financial situation that we find ourselves in. And one of the great challenges for me in all of this is how we take colleagues with us on the journey, that this is not just something that we do, it's not a what, but it's how we do our day-to-day business and how we find time to actually recognise the value of engaging and working in and with our communities. So that's a journey we're very much still on. It's a journey that was set out by Christie in 2011. It's a journey that COSLA followed up in terms of the Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy in 2014. And it's a journey that we're very much committed to in terms of working as spheres of government and making sure that the powers that need to be transferred from national to local are done so, and then that very much the powers from local down to in the hearts of our communities are done as well. And clearly throughout the COVID experience, we've seen the real strength of community and that kind of partnership working. I think in terms of where we are in these practices in Scotland, actually we've got a long journey already ourselves in terms of what we're doing, not only from the establishment of community planning partnerships back in 2004, but from the early piloting of participatory budgeting back in 2009 with a number of authorities across Scotland. So we're very much continued on that participatory budgeting journey at the moment, obviously with our commitment with Scottish Government to work towards 1% of all budgets being open to PB. But we've also very much, there have been examples across the country of many publics, of charrettes, of citizens' juries as well. So there's been a complete and utter open-mindedness to actually the methods that we can use and the ways in which we can engage, whether that be about kind of critical issues of tackling inequality, whether it be about tackling or working within the criminal justice system and working with young people to enhance their future opportunities. There's lots of really good examples happening all the time of ways in which we're looking to engage. So I think Scotland's in a very good place. There is a want to strengthen our local democracy and make sure that people are engaged and that actually people do feel they've got a voice. And I think it's really just the opportunity to keep hearing the international experiences that we've got, but also, I suppose, critically, and we're doing this very well through the PB network in Scotland, is sharing our own local experiences so that we can all enhance and develop what we do.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simon. And I think you've been quite modest here in terms of the role that local government has played on this, because, you know, well before this high-profile citizens' assemblies became fashionable, local government in Scotland was already carrying out all sorts of mini publics on health inequalities, on wind farms, on education, school, community policing. So a lot of pioneering work took place much closer to communities. So thanks, Simon. I'm going to ask Doreen to briefly give us her perspective on these two questions. And I suppose speaking from within the Scottish Government.
Thanks, Oliver. And yes, of course, I am within Scottish Government. I've been working on open government for a number of years. And one of the things that I've learned internationally, working with other member countries in open government, is the value of working with citizens and participants, and actually not just citizens. We use that term, but of course so many of our most vulnerable people aren't citizens, and it's really important to be able to hear as wide a range of voices as possible. I suppose my context for this is very much around Scotland has set out in the National Performance Framework, aligning it to Sustainable Development Goals. We have plans and strategies around person-centred care, and there is no question that over the last 10 years or so, that acknowledgement that there is a real value, not just a benefit to civil servants or ministers, but there is a real benefit for how we all live in making sure that we are getting ways of working with people so they can properly influence things. But that's not necessarily all that easy. As Oliver and Simon have both said, we have been doing experiments over time. We did, the Chief Medical Officer a couple of years ago now did a really interesting citizen jury on sharing treatment plans between clinicians and patients. And we have applied more innovative ways of thinking with citizen panels. We also, of course, now have 2 citizen assemblies on the stocks. And what's really interesting, and I noticed a question in the chat about why are we surprised that citizens come up with the right answers. I don't think we are. I think what we haven't yet worked out is how we make sure that that is effective. So making sure that we have processes that are able to be credible, that are able to provide absolutely balanced evidence, and looking at the policies where this is the most useful tool, where we will have a particular challenge that this using deliberation is the most effective way. What governments are very shy about is counting the cost of failed policies. And what we need to be much clearer on is how we articulate the benefit of getting people involved all the way through our processes. So Gillian and Simon and I have been involved in discussions about how we make sure that we don't leave gaps between us, that we are listening across the whole sphere of government and trying to make sure that where we are involving people, that we aren't wasting people's time. That is a really important element, that we value the people that are involved in these deliberative processes, whatever they are. And there will be a range of ways of using it. And our 2 citizens' assemblies are going to be very different in themselves. The first one, of course, met face to face for a while, has an incredibly broad remit, and they've done a magnificent job of whittling through that remit. The second is more specific and is like many countries looking at climate change. So the way that we support and develop the skills to be able to run these form of events is really important for us to learn. So the Open Government Plan in Scotland is a place where we have made a commitment to doing that learning and sharing it and thinking about what a framework for public servants looks like in order to support them to have the confidence, the competence, to know where to go to find the expertise, to know what it is we're trying to deliver here. So I'm going to stop there. But what the final thing I would say is I've seen in the Q&A a lot of people keen to continue this conversation. The Open Government team is really keen to keep that conversation going so we can learn the lessons. So we will come back to people on that. Sorry, Oliver.
Great. Thank you. No, that was great, Doreen. That's brilliant. So we have a lot of substantial issues to get our teeth into, and I'm going to propose that we do it this way. I think we're going to start with one of the big issues, which is institutionalization, power dynamics, processes taking place within institutions that already have their own power systems. So I'm going to come to Claudia on that in a second with a couple of specific questions from the box. Then there are some questions that have to do with the politics of evidence. And there's a technical side to that and a political side to that. And to that, I think I will be coming to Gillian on questions of evidence, especially because the Scottish Parliament has a really interesting evidence brokering system itself. And I know they've been trying to adapt it as well to the context of deliberative processes. Then there are questions on digital and so on. And I'll distribute those as well to Doreen and Simon, but I'll come back to Claudia as well on the digital side of things. But let's start with the biggie, Claudia. So, I mean, I think Kathy puts it very nicely and very succinctly here. But there are 2 questions. I'll read both, but I think Kathy got the gist here. If deliberative processes become more institutionalized, isn't there a risk of processes being compromised? And there is a question, there is almost like an elaboration on that question by Justin and Eva, when they say, well, you know, these things can be organized from civil society, or they can be organized institutionally, or it could be a hybrid as well. So they are interested in what are the pros and cons of, in this case, citizens' assemblies, for example, being government-led or being citizen-led. What are the constraints, what are the positives, where are the opportunities, where are the risks? And they give the examples of some of the civil society organized processes like the G1000 and the various versions of that. Yeah, I mean, what are the risks, the pros and cons of institutionalization?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver, and thanks for the questions that came in from Kathy and Justin and Eva on that. I mean, those are all really, really good and important questions to be thinking about. I mean, in terms of the specific point about being compromised, not sure if I'm fully understanding it in the way you mean it, but what we have recommended as one of the good practice principles in the OECD report is this idea of having the process being organized at arm's length from the commissioning public authority. And this is one of those principles that I would say would be translated or should be translated into any process that then gets institutionalized as well. So the same people who have a stake in the outcome or are there to listen to the recommendations should not be the ones who have the responsibility to be doing all of the design details, choosing the experts, etc. I mean, it doesn't mean that that role can't be played by civil servants. Actually, one of our other recommendations is that for the longer term, there should be a capacity within government to have an office or an agency or something where there is a group of civil servants that have the training and the capacity to be able to design and run these processes. So it's not something that always gets outsourced. But I think that there are certainly different design things that can be put into place to ensure that they don't get compromised. And this was precisely one of the motivations actually for designing or for developing the OECD good practice principles to have a set of key kind of guidelines and best practices in place that are not too prescriptive, which still allowed for different models to be used and different approaches, but which nonetheless follow a certain set of you know, a certain level of rigor and are done in a certain way to inspire trust and confidence and legitimacy. On the second point, though, I think it's a slightly different question, not necessarily just related to institutionalization, but from what I'm getting here is like, why are we only looking at the government-led processes, and should we be discounting the ones that are done by civil society? Now, I don't want to, that's not what we're saying. There was a reason why we've only focused on the ones that were initiated by public authorities, because they are the only ones who then have the authority to be able to respond to and actually act on and put into place the recommendations that come from citizens. So we know from other research that there's also different impacts that come from a process not being initiated by someone with the authority to then do something with the outcome. It has an implication in terms of who is even willing to put themselves forward to participate in such a process. It has an implication for dropout rates partway through the process. And so all of these things which might seem minor actually have a big impact on what kind of outcome comes out of it at the end of the day. Now, that's not to say that the G1000 process in Belgium, which was citizen-led, wasn't important, but it had zero impact in terms of changing any form of policy. At the same time, what it did do, which was very positive, and which is why I think civil society-led initiatives should still be happening, is that it completely changed the public debate in Belgium about citizen deliberation and its potential, and I think has been one of the reasons why actually Belgium today is one of the countries where we see the most experimentation with different forms of deliberative initiatives taking place really at all levels of the administration. So I think that there's also maybe a different role that can be played when it is initiated by civil society that ends up being more of a role to kind of put pressure to move things in a certain direction, rather than to be able to give citizens any form of promise that their recommendations will then get picked up by government.
Right, so the advantage would be that there's a direct channel into institutional decision making versus being disconnected and being. I'm going to move on to the next question in a second, but I want to give you 30 seconds on a follow-up challenge that might follow from that. Because one might argue, well, then that also means that those decisions will have to, in some way, fit or align within the existing agendas of that particular institution. Have you come across in the data set of any cases where, you know, the recommendations, the decisions, the propositions by these bodies challenged the very institutions that have hosted them and pushed them maybe a little bit farther than they might be prepared to go?
I feel like Doreen is willing to come in on that one after. But yes, I mean, obviously, you know, these processes, we also have to state at the outset too, are meant to complement our representative deliberative or our representative democracy, I mean. So they're not a replacement. So at the end of the day, it is going to be decision makers who decide, but their process of decision making changes. Instead of just following the usual channels, they have introduced this whole process beforehand, which involves citizens in a meaningful way, where they've been able to give some more informed recommendations. Now, the evidence I have is more qualitative and actually perhaps more anecdotal is the appropriate term in terms of the conversations that I've had with different ministers and mayors and politicians and civil servants that have been on the initiating side of such processes, to say that a lot of the time the types of recommendations that come forward are not necessarily even that new or novel sometimes, but they often are that one step further than what politicians would have dared to do without having such a process in place and having a sense that, like, oh, actually, this is what citizens want, when they have the time and the chance to consider the evidence and to speak with one another. So I would say that there is some evidence to suggest that these kinds of processes can help push the policy agenda in a way which is slightly more ambitious than what politicians would dare to do otherwise.
Thank you. I sense that Doreen wants to come in, so I'm going to give you a few seconds, Doreen, before I move us on to the next thing. Please come in.
I was really just going to answer that. I think we have to look at that kind of balance, and the place that we saw perhaps best the Assembly coming up with something that the commissioning body would never have touched was, of course, Ireland in the abortion question. And to a degree, this kind of process can really help with those absolutely challenging kinds of issues, because when the citizens get into a room, they can be as radical as they choose to be. And the power needs to sit with them to be able to respond back to their commissioning body, the advice that they choose to give. So I absolutely would see that as a key role of the Citizen Assembly.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm gonna, as I said, I'm gonna move us on now to talking a little bit about evidence and contested evidence and some of the dilemmas around that. And I'm gonna come to Gillian on that. There are new questions as well, so I'm going to start to plot them. I think it would be ideal if we take just roughly around a minute each when we are answering, so that we try to get through as many questions as possible, so that then we can circle back and maybe begin to join the dots between some of these questions. So the next one is on evidence, and it was the very first question that came up. It was from Chris Hanlon. He was saying, I'm interested in people's thoughts about the process of choosing experts to inform deliberative processes. Evidence from participants in the Irish example was that first-hand evidence from women affected by the ban on abortion was important in informing the Assembly's decision. And the recent controversy on social media about the choosing of the evidence leads for the Scottish Climate Assembly raises a number of questions around this, and how to, you know, what do we consider evidence? What do we consider the role of expertise? What forms of knowledge are valued in this kind of processes? And what kind of systems do we put around these processes to accommodate that range of evidence? So I'm tempted to come to Gillian on this, just because I'm sure this is something you've had to put a lot of thought into.
And it's a really interesting question, because there's a lot of issues for me around who you hear from, whether you're persuaded by people who are particularly good at presenting, whether there's a tendency to go for the kind of classic BBC balance of kind of for and against, which may not always be the right way of having a complex discussion, and also how you bring in evidence that's more about experience than about you know, a research base or a stakeholder group. And I think there's examples of all of those things being done. But I suppose the other thing I'm really interested in is the extent of the power you give to the participants to decide who they hear from and how they hear from them. And I think it's so from my experience, you know, you have a tendency when you're organizing one of these things to want to have things pinned down so that people feel they're coming into a process that is professional and well controlled and that will get through it in the time available and all those things. But I just wonder if there's scope for a bit more messiness, and I think some activities have experimented with that, where you do give some space for the participants to say, well, no, actually what we think, having learned a bit about this, we need to hear from is this. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that I think there's a real difference between parliaments and governments doing these kind of things, simply because parliaments are much more used to working on a cross-party basis. They're not working with the government. So, for example, we've used our parliamentary researchers a lot to help us with this evidence thing, and their whole job is about kind of achieving that balance and breadth. And
so how did you do it in those deliberative processes you already organized? And given how lucky you are that you have SPICE, the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, who are well known worldwide as knowledge brokers, how are you joining those dots between all these different types of knowledge? And you were talking, I mean, obviously experiential knowledge and so on, with the formal kind of research knowledge.
For the health related one, we did SPICE were the main deliverers of information, and they were coming from that place of having a reputation for you know, for kind of balance and trustability. So we were kind of exploiting that to use them as part of our kind of expert delivery. But I think then how you allow people to process that, because people need to then kind of be able to relate that to their experience and talk about it in different ways, and it can't all just be about even discussions. So for the health one, we were letting people do very kind of visual activities where they were designing a health service for their area, and kind of, you know, using like little houses and people and things that would just kind of bring a different kind of processing of the information. So it wasn't about kind of who's got the most convincing verbal argument. It was also about how people feel about healthcare and what their own experiences are, and trying to mesh all that with very knowledgeable input.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of answers James's question. There was a question around the complexity of conveying different types of evidence and the skill that it takes to be able to communicate and engage, and the variety of formats and the different styles of learning and engaging that people have, and how to cater to all those different ways of learning and talking. Great, thanks, Gillian. I think there is still underneath this, and a kind of, and I'm tempted to put it to Doreen very quickly before we move on to talk about digital. There is something here, I mean, around the recent controversy on the Scottish Climate Assembly and the expert leads. That was part of the question that was being put to us. And you sit on the stewarding group of the Scottish Climate Assembly. I just wonder if you got any quick reflections on how the evidence and the evidence leads have been set up, and what's going on around that.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, I think there's two things I want to say. One is I think the stewarding group were really active, and the debate in the steering group about what counted as evidence and how we do that was a really valuable discussion. And of course, XR contributed to that hugely. I think I was in the end satisfied that the team that were pulled together were recognized that it needs to be a really broad set of evidence, but that we have to be really clear about the impacts of climate change. So I think there is a question there. And I think it's right that we hold these questions and as we learn about doing these kinds of processes, we are really thoughtful about who's making decisions and who it is that is deciding which bits of evidence to weigh, because that really matters. I hugely agree with what's being said about that. The other side of that is that we actually have quite a bit of training to do about how we value the evidence from this kind of way of working. So policymakers right across the spectrum are, and you know, you can imagine the First Minister at the moment making decisions about COVID. She's getting expert advice from scientists, she's getting expert advice from statisticians, she's getting expert advice. We want this form of evidence to have the same kind of value as those are. So it is about being able both to give, make sure that the evidence, and I agree with Gillian, it isn't just about having a BBC style of, you know, you have two experts doing that and two experts doing that. It is much more subtle. And as the evidence for the Climate Change Assembly has developed, it really feels as if they have got that subtlety coming through. But we will test that.
Okay, we might come back to this. In a second, I'm going to go to Simon for a question from Alex that is about, you know, potential support for the point we were making earlier about who organizes these things, and I suppose also the role of supporting smaller charities and community organizations to organize their own processes. But before I do that, I want to move us on to digital. There was an early question from Paul Bittles, and there's another one, and I'll come back to that one a bit later. But the first question was about, well, Claudia, so this report came out pre-COVID, and you know, a lot of this work has moved online, and the digital public sphere has expanded beyond our wildest imaginations just a year ago. So what is it that we're learning about digital, and how might your report be different if all of these have been taken into account? What are your early reflections on the move towards the digital space on this, which connects as well to a question that Annika was posing to us on the pros and cons of digital?
Yeah, no, all the questions about digital are really pertinent and really important, and we've been thinking a lot about them at the OECD since the spring. We've been doing a series of articles on our Participo blog around digital for deliberation, but also doing some other research and work beyond that. I mean, first thing I do want to just clarify that it was actually a very conscious choice at the outset of this research also to focus on in-person deliberations only. I mean, mostly just even for comparative research purposes, that we were comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges, because the online deliberations are just very different in nature to what can be achieved in person, and that just needs to be acknowledged in terms of how, you know, what our expectations are about how they're done and what kind of outcome is really possible at the end of it. I mean, something that we're seeing is, I mean, there's some parts that I think we have been finding are easier to move to an online context than other elements of it. I mean, part of what makes the in-person processes really work in terms of the magic of them is people have the time and the chance to really build some trust between one another, because before anything starts, there's time for them to meet informally, to have coffees or a dinner, or, you know, have some activities that are not about the topic itself. They just become a bit comfortable with one another as people. They have the time over the course of a longer period of time to be able to get to a point of, on a very controversial issue, being able to sit across from someone who maybe they disagree with fundamentally at the beginning, but get to a point of saying, well, I don't really see things that way, but I see where you're coming from, so I could meet you halfway on that, or I could live with that. I think that when we're designing things in an online setting, it's a lot harder to get people to really deliberate and work on recommendations collectively. And I think that pre-COVID, a lot of the online deliberation world was very much text-based. very much more focused on individual deliberation rather than group deliberation. And so what we've been seeing in terms of some of the new approaches since the spring are the practitioners who usually do in-person deliberations now experimenting with online approaches. But I'm personally finding that those designs are very radically different to what was being done pre-COVID. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, just on that point, because that allows us to quickly address a question from Sam Hill. And he's asking, you know, what kind of features in a platform enable or restrict our ability to carry out deliberative work?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different features that both enable and restrict. I mean, I think some of the hardest elements, what I was saying, is actually that just that feeling that comes from being in a room with other people. I think that it's been working fairly well for getting people also to do like their smaller group deliberations. But what is important for any of these deliberative processes is that at the end of the day, there's some common ground found and people work together as the wider group on the recommendations. It's not an aggregate of the individual opinions of the people who are part of this. It's really something that's developed collectively. And I think we're still seeing that that's quite a bit more difficult in an online setting than happens in person, where you can more naturally move around a room, come together, come apart, and so on. So it has just another design challenge and sense. Like, I don't think we were using video platforms really before COVID, or not anywhere near to an extent as we're seeing now. And I think at least it's clearly not the same, but still having that like physical connection is important. I think we're seeing practitioners experiment with things like, before the process even starts, all the participants receiving in the post like the same little kind of box that has some post-it notes and some markers and maybe some chocolates or things like that, you know, at least, you know, everyone else is also getting the same, they're also using these things. And, you know, so it requires some thoughts about like, how do you recreate some of those things that worked well in person in an online setting to still make people feel like a collective. And also I think it's quite tiring to be looking at a screen all day. So you can't just be redesigning a full day session as an online full day thing either. But I have to say I've been impressed at seeing some of the kind of innovative approaches to how we overcome this, to ensure that there's still, you know, 35, 40 hours of deliberations happening with the online processes overall, which again, I think is very different to a lot of the online deliberations that were happening before COVID, which I think were very short.
Yeah, no, that's
and
great.
Not comparative again.
It is a real challenge, isn't it? But at the same time, we are seeing the emergence of a new generation of digital platforms, and there are great hopes and some great examples. I mean, the case of V-Taiwan and using Polis and some of the digital infrastructure they've been using, it has some promising elements. But also, we are going to learn a lot from everything that's been happening this year. I mean, in Scotland, for example, a lot of participatory budgeting has had to move online, and there's a lot of ongoing learning from that. The Climate Assembly is digitally native. So again, I think we're going to learn a lot from that. I'm going to, and of course, you know, at some point we are going to come back to face-to-face meetings, although I suspect, you know, there are some features that will be useful to take back with us to face-to-face meetings, like the mute button.
Yeah.
Okay,
and I think we'll see more hybrid approaches as well.
Yeah, indeed. Let me come to Simon next, because there was a question from Alex. And although, Simon, I know you are positioned within, you know, networks of local government, but you work very closely with the third sector, with the community sector and partnerships and so on. So there's a question there in terms of what kind of support is out there for these deliberative processes to become more commonplace at local level, or in the processes of different networks, organizations, and in the third and community sectors?
Yeah, I suppose just quickly in terms of the IT point and the digital side of things, and I think that kind of last point is how do we get the hybrid very much is one of the things, because clearly what I would just very quickly say about that is, at least during COVID, Scottish local government has caught up probably about 15, maybe even 20 years. Some are a bit generous and say only 10 years, but I think we need to be a bit more honest and say we've caught up a heck of a lot in the recent times. So we are learning really good ways of using digital technology. And I hope that it does enhance how we do these processes. I think particularly where we see the idea generation element that can be done online before then getting into that kind of physical space together. So sorry, that was a quick reflection on those points. But in terms of at a local level, the support, we are challenged within local government because of the resources that we've got, the teams that we necessarily maybe once had and that we'd be able to kind of work with different charities at a local level. However, in saying that, yet again, I think you're seeing that changing quite rapidly because of the COVID experience. And I know that there's a lot of work going on across the different kind of community planning teams in terms of that kind of local engagement and how we kind of support local third sector and voluntary organisations, because of the absolutely huge amount of work that they've helped do during this kind of period of time and the rest. So in terms of, I suppose, Alex, the specifics about what's available is it will vary across the country. Yet again, that's just unfortunately the nature of Scottish local government, the different size and scale of the authorities we've got, indeed the size and scale of the geographies that are there. But I would hope that what you're seeing now is, and as we move forward in terms of engaging, we've set out in COSLA the blueprint for Scottish local government, which yet again picks up all the strong themes of Christie, all the strong themes of the Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy, of involvement, engagement, deliberation with our communities and the rest. And indeed, obviously, therefore embraces the whole open government agenda. And what I would hope you see is that actually, if there are local organisations that are keen to develop their practice, keen to be more involved and engaged, the opportunities will be coming more and more as we move forward, because clearly as we get into, and dare I start to talk about budget time and so forth, the challenges are only going to increase. So we're going to need to work in more imaginative and effective ways. And critically, our partners in the third voluntary sector are going to be vital to that.
Thanks, Simon. Just while I have you here, and now we have just 9 minutes before I start to wrap up. So we're going to go a little bit faster through some of these questions. But there was a question that was either for yourself or for Gillian. And it says, since one of the main aims of representative democracy is engaging people of different cultures and social statuses, who are often the most affected by some of these issues discussed, how do you ensure diversity of individuals within this type of processes? There has been a question by an answer by Tom Lord, and I suspect that already goes some way. Yeah, any quick thoughts on that from either you or Gillian?
I suppose I would quickly go back to, in terms of these processes and so forth, not being purist about the processes, and actually what we need to think about all the time are the different engagement points that we've got and the ways in which we can attract people into the processes. In Scottish local government, colleagues every day are based in their communities and engaging with different people. So it really is, I suppose it's back to that comment I made at the start. How do we make this not something that we do, but it's how our jobs are actually done, and people see it as part of it? Because we often get people saying we need to go back to having large kind of community development teams and so on and so forth. Honestly, because the way funding is, we're not going to get back to a time where we can have those types of structures within Scottish local government. What we need to do is make sure that actually people in all of the roles that they do understand that this is part of how they do their daily tasks. And I think probably if we get that mindset happening and develop the practice in that way, we can actually draw in the broader range of representation and the rest. And sorry, I've not seen the answer that's provided there.
That's all right. Yeah, no, that's okay. I think Gillian also wants to add something here quickly.
Yeah, I mean, just I suppose it's worth saying we aim for more diverse. We know it's not perfectly representative. We know it's not. There are people in Scotland who wouldn't want to take part in something like this at the moment. So there's groups and people that will be missing out and wouldn't respond to an invitation. But I think it's interesting when we ask people why they came, that there were so many reasons why they came, and sometimes it was a sort of civic duty, wanting to be part of things. For one guy, it was we were paying them a bit of money to take part, and that meant he could afford to visit his son in Edinburgh for the first time. And it doesn't matter that that's why he's taking part, because once he was there, he was engaging just as much as anybody else. So it's kind of almost like trying to attract people in a whole lot of different ways. Somebody came because they thought they had to, because they'd had this crested invitation from the Parliament, and didn't kind of think they ought to say no to it because it was maybe like a jury invitation or something. So lots of different reasons why people come, and the group of people we had, there were people there who had never visited the Parliament building. In fact, most of them hadn't visited the Parliament building, and wouldn't have thought of doing so.
Great, thank you, Gillian. I'm going to come to Claudia quickly on the question of outcomes, and there are a couple of questions in that direction. The questions by Brit Cullen and James, and maybe I suppose the broad question here is, what is the evidence base that says that this is a good thing to do? And this is, I suppose, a question that anyone who is involved in the field of democratic innovation faces all the time. So I wonder, Claudia, given your sort of panoramic perspective across these types of processes and these types of contexts, what would be your answer to that? Your 40 seconds answer to that.
40 seconds answer to that complex question. No, I mean, in a nutshell, it's not based just on the data itself, but again, also the conversations that I've had with the kind, like the ministers and the civil servants and so on, that have been on the other side of why this has been useful to them. And I mean, in a nutshell, it has helped them to actually be able to take action on hard problems. Again, we're not saying that deliberative processes are really necessary or useful for every single type of policy issue either, but where they really add value is on those issues where, you know, politicians are just a bit stuck, that no matter what they do, someone is going to be a bit unhappy, and how do you, but something needs to be done. So how do you actually find some form of middle ground and a way to be able to advance and go forward on things, to be able to incorporate perhaps some more radical ideas as well, and to be able to do something. So I think at the end of the day, it comes to the fact that this is just a more effective problem-solving tool for certain types of issues, and we shouldn't be trying to paint them as a magic bullet solution either, or trying to say that they should be used for any and everything either. So. Thank
you. That's very helpful. And I think Marlise's question has been kind of answered by Tom, but if not, you let me know. I want to skip ahead and kind of do a quick final round where I throw a few of the remaining questions to each of you. So there is a question about standards. So Hannah Dixon is asking about standards, and I think Simon was reflecting earlier on, you know, and Gillian as well, on the risks of becoming a purist. And but I suppose, Claudia, if I can put this to you, you are kind of setting out some level of standards, at least in terms of the criteria that you used to include things in the report. So do standards matter, and why?
I mean, coming from the OECD and having developed some form of this, I would say that yes, standards do matter. I think we were very conscious when developing them for them not to be too prescriptive, so that they do leave room for experimentation. They leave room for the fact that we've identified 12 different models of deliberative processes in the report that I would say could all be fulfilled with those different design options, but still fulfilling those overarching good practice principles. So the idea behind the principles is, how would you design something that on the one hand leads to something which are actually informed, useful recommendations for policymakers, and on the other hand is designed in a way that is fair and transparent and can be trusted by the wider public. So those were the two overarching goals, and after that, those 11 good practice principles fit under that. So I would invite people to have a look at them, and I'm always open to having a conversation about them as well.
That's brilliant, Claudia. And I will be coming back to you for the final word in just around 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you to address the challenging question that Paul Beatles is asking there, in terms of, you know, what are the downsides? What are the risks of this deliberative wave? Are there potentially anti-democratic effects? So I'll come back to you for your final reflection on that. But before that, I'm going to ask Doreen and also Gillian about the point that Ella makes there about whether, the question about whether there are plans to involve the public in COVID regulations and legislation. I'll ask Doreen as well to address the question about the Citizens Assembly and whether you're surprised with any of the outputs. And and Doreen, I'll probably come to you on the climate one as well, because you sit on that board. So shall we start? Let's start, and it needs to be quite brief. Let's start with Gillian, and this will be your final reflection. So pack into it anything else you want to say before we go. Yeah, any plans to involve the public more in COVID regulation and legislation?
Yes, but I can't say any more at the moment because it's still being agreed.
Okay, I love that kind of short answer. We are intrigued and hooked, and we'll keep an eye on what comes out. Doreen, from your side of things?
I suppose, yes. On COVID, we're looking at what we can do because we believe that very much there is a need to involve people, and we're looking at what that mechanism can be. I will come back with more information as soon as I have it, and very happy to take views from people.
Great, thank you very much. Now, if you can quickly address two questions, and actually they should lead to fairly quick answers. Is the Scottish Climate Assembly, in the Scottish Climate Assembly, are citizens, the members of the Assembly themselves, able to call witnesses, informants, or advocates to come and speak to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Once they get going and have got their feet under the table, they will be able to say, well, actually, you know, now we've looked at this, we would like to hear from X and Y and Z. Yes, absolutely. Okay.
And how about the question about anything that surprised you from the first assembly, the Assembly on the Future of Scotland? There are some surprising things emerging in some of the recommendations. It's worth saying that they haven't been voted on yet, so some of them might change, might evolve, and some of them might or might not pass. But anything that has surprised you so far on the outputs?
No, not really. Having because I'm also on the student group for that, so I observed many of the Assembly meetings and have been bowled over by the quality of the deliberation at it, because it was such a wide remit to have come up with some really powerful ideas on the future of Scotland. Doesn't surprise me. I'm heartened by it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Simon and Gillian, if you have any burning final reflection before we go, I can give you 20 seconds each. Anything you could add?
Yeah, just to say that I'm really, really interested in the questions of empowerment that are being raised. One of our founding principles is power sharing, and it's the one that we find it really, really challenging to put into practice. So I'm looking for ways of using this that also leave the people who take part feeling more empowered to go and do something else as well, and to have a place to go.
Thanks a lot, Gillian. Simon?
And I think actually that's just a really good kind of strong point to kind of finish on, is how do we actually make sure that what we end up here with, and because we talk all the time about strengthening local democracy, that fundamentally means that people want to be engaged and stay engaged and involved. And I suppose the key thing for me is, how do we pitch it that you can be involved in the things that you want to be involved in? You don't have to be involved in everything all of the time. So it's getting the balance right there.
Okay, thank you. And we are finishing with well, the big questions, Claudia, which, you know, I mean, yeah, what is the downside of this? What do we need to be mindful of as we see the development and mainstreaming of some of these processes in institutions?
Yeah, no, I mean, Paul's question is a really very, very pertinent one. Just reading through all of it now, even the part about the randomness, representativeness, etc. I mean, it's not a perfect method either, and this is why people in the field are always saying broadly representative rather than making any claims that this is some perfect microcosm of society either. But it does seem to be the best way of actually reaching those people, as I think it was Gillian who was saying, you know, people who don't normally go to like open meetings, who sometimes don't even vote, who aren't active in their communities. By receiving the sort of random invitation to participate, you're also bringing in those voices into the room and being able to empower those people, because there's also, I mean, some research on this, but also I have quite a bit of more qualitative evidence from discussions I've had that the participants who take part in such a deliberative process at the end of it have a much greater sense of political efficacy and agency so if they hadn't voted before, they then get more engaged in politics, or they might become more active in their communities to volunteer, etc. Participating in something where you've actually been able to have a meaningful contribution and to spend so much time both with the learning and hearing from other people has a really, really, really powerful effect on people. And again, I think the evidence on how we're translating that in an online context is still yet to be seen in terms of that empowering aspect of it as well. I think one thing I do want to stress yet again, because I saw in Paul's comment about some campaigners calling for sortition and deliberation to be replacing elections and parliaments, that's not at all what I'm saying here in any case, that this is something that is a complement to representative democracy. It is not a magic bullet solution that will solve all our problems. And actually, most of the time, these processes are designed in such a way to also have a more participatory element, especially a lot of the processes that we see happening in more contemporary settings today. So the idea is not just to involve a small group of people, but to have different, more broader forms of participation, but that are designed in a way which is sequenced and fits in with the deliberations of a more broadly representative group of people. Finally, I think I'll just end and say that part of the recommendations that we made at the end of the report based on all of this research and work is also to say that there need to be other legislative or regulatory changes that should happen to make these processes also more possible and inclusive. Things like making, giving people the same rights they have when they're selected for jury duty, if they're selected to be in such a process like this, to be able to have paid leave to participate during the week, so they're not always having to do these processes on the weekends. I know that this is being talked about in Belgium at the moment. I'm not sure if that's the case elsewhere yet, but we are hoping that our report also provokes such discussions within amongst legislators about what they need to be doing to make participation genuinely more inclusive. Also making access available to different data sets of the population, so that we're not limiting invitations going out to people just on the electoral roll, for instance. So these sorts of rules vary from country to country, but there's a whole set of considerations and other actions that need to be taken for this not to be anti-democratic. And actually, on that point, I will just end with a final plug for the good practice principles, because again, those principles are also with an aim in mind to prevent these processes being used for anti-democratic purposes, to prevent them from being used to just legitimate decisions already taken. So the emphasis on the arm's length organization, for instance, the transparency about how experts are chosen, which experts are chosen, how were the participants randomly selected, etc. All of that information should be made public. So those are the sorts of things we're also emphasizing, and I think also help to strengthen that potential anti-democratic tendency that could arise if these processes are manipulated.
Yeah, that really takes us to the end. I know we're just over a couple of minutes. I just want to, I want to say thanks to all of you, of course, Claudia, for coming virtually to Scotland. You're always welcome, and keep bringing your reports. And indeed to Gillian, Simon, and Doreen, Niamh as well, helping us, and Kelly backstage. I suppose for me, there are lots of reasons to be optimistic, but there are also reasons to be cautious. And anyone who cares about the future knows that democracy is in trouble, not just here, but all over the world. And this is a really important moment where we're trying to build the foundations for a democratic system, or a series and a variety of democratic systems that can cope with the complexity of the crises that are coming our way. So this is where we are, and we are building the plane as we fly, and that's always difficult. We are learning as we go, and that's always difficult. My hope is that in a few years' time, we will not have to talk about participatory democracy, radical democracy, agonistic democracy, deliberative democracy. We'll just talk about democracy and the core constitutive practices: participation, deliberation, representation. And that we'll have a system capable of coping with what's coming and holding us together in some kind of desirable future. On that note, I'm going to thank you all for being there on the other side of the screen. And thanks again, Claudia, for doing us and providing so much for thought. We'll keep the work going and we'll keep developing all these different ecologies of participation, of which, of course, the deliberative wave is an important part. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Oliver, Doreen, everyone. Good
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doreen. Bye.
Bye.